Welcome to Spatial Conversations, the world's first video series recorded entirely with the Apple Vision Pro. I'm Alex Bratton, Lextech's CEO and Chief Geek. And in our Spatial Conversations, we bring fellow Apple Vision Pro experts, enthusiasts, and innovators to discuss the Vision Pro for business and productivity in the enterprise. We also cover the intersection of spatial computing, other cutting-edge technology, and business. My guest today is Arian, the managing partner of Earthling VC. Welcome, Arian.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me. This is fun. This is the first time I'm actually doing a podcast, a conversation like that in a Vision Pro, so it's a fun experience for me.
Awesome. So it's a cool start already?
Oh yeah, terrific. Absolutely terrific.
Beautiful.
It's exciting. I mean, I learned a lot about the Vision Pro even just from this, so it's great.
I love that. And that's something that I've actually really just enjoyed so much with all of us who are starting to take this early journey, just how much learning we get to do together and kind of experience different things. And it's something I've loved it about the VR space in particular, but as we now get into spatial computing and some of Apple's entries with it, it brings us some new stuff to pick up.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, very cool. Well, let's talk about you a little bit. And in particular, I'd like to start with really, what's your passion? So you're doing things. So obviously, VC world, that means helping folks start things. You've started things in the past. You've got a background touching lots of spatial AI and otherwise. Boiling all that down, what's your passion?
I think it's two things. I mean, on one hand, I've always been very interested in just like the change in computing, right? I mean, so my kind of like real first serious foray into startups generally is actually through AI. So, I was running a company. I dropped out of college, started a company in 2014. And so I had to learn how to build AI at that time. And so, we were doing a ranking algorithm. And
serious early days as far as things coming to market.
I always have to tell people that, I know now you think of like there's ChatGPT and PyTorch, it's really easy to do the stuff. You have all these GPUs everywhere you can plug into. Like, no, back then we were writing C code and like running it on our laptops, right? Like it was a very, very different kind of world, but you could see the writing on the wall. And so, I got very interested in that, and that also is kind of what led me down to VR, basically, to make a long story short, because the AI stuff, anyway, I ended up at Meta. Then when we tried the early quests, I had this similar aha moment with it where I'm like, this is going to change things, right? So on one hand, it's just this general trend about like, the how we're advancing in computing. It's becoming more and more human for all intents and purposes as time goes on.
I like that description.
But then on the other hand, it's, I found myself to be like, I love the idea that particularly in the US, we can, the world is a canvas, right? So you have all this new tech that's going to change everything, and everything is a canvas. So it needs to be built. I just determined that I'm a pretty bad builder myself, terrible CEO. So I was, and I think I found myself to be a better investor. And so, I think that's just the way to kind of have outsized impact in terms of like promoting, building this future with these tools. For me personally, some people are going to be better founders. Some people are going to be better, I think investors. It's just, I think you got to figure out what works for you. And so for me, it's the investing for sure.
Perfect. Well, and it takes an ecosystem to get there. So I respect that, and being true to yourself is really important.
Yeah.
So congratulations on finding that.
I appreciate. Yeah. I mean, let's see what well, in 10 years we'll see if I'm actually good at this or not, right? But I feel like I'm doing an okay job. So let's see. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I know as a part of, and again, in the crossover between virtual reality, or which I'll now just say spatial, and AI. So I've seen the word spatial AI associated with you. What does spatial AI mean?
It's actually a good question, because I think there are a lot of ways that you can go in this, right? Because I think the thing that I found difficult to do, for example, when I pitched the fund to LPs, right, is, I talk about VR and AI and robotics and all these kinds of things, right? And like everybody just condenses it down to like, wait, so you invest in VR. And so like, wait, why are you also investing in AI and robotics and these kinds of things? And I'm like, because, if you start to sort of condense it down, you can't ignore, you're basically decapping yourself if you're saying, I'm only going to invest in VR that doesn't touch AI, robotics, all these other things, right? And so I think the general idea that the way I think of this at a high level, all the AI systems we have now, they give us insights. They give us insights about information on the internet. Now with computer vision, they're giving us insights about...
In a little chat window.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. Right, precisely, right? But, basically we have all these systems that can tell us a lot of things about our environments, in at least in a two-dimensional way. But the problem is or the gap is, like, as humans, we're spatial beings, right? So these insights are only as valuable as, to the extent that we can instrument them. And so a lot of these things just do require us to instrument them in the real world. And so now we're getting into a world where finally we have computers like robotics, like VR headsets, right? Eventually we go with AR glasses and all this stuff, where we actually have a user interface able to do that. And so I think this idea of spatial AI to me, is very synonymous almost with how some people talk about VR, or some people talk about robotics, right? This idea that we're going to take computing insights and actually apply them to real world physical problems, which is the world we live in at the end of the day. And so I think it's really just a kind of a catch-all term that really anything that falls under the idea of getting us to that future, right, is inevitably like an intersection of all these things. So of the AI discipline, of VR, depending on what you're doing, robotics, right? And that's that I think almost like at some point the idea of spatial AI versus just normal AI is actually going to be a redundant point, right? Like I think at some point it's just going to
Kind
be
of like mobile apps just became apps.
correct, right?
Yes.
Where it's just like this is just going to be like the default modality in which this discipline is applied, right? And so I think it's a niche thing now, but I think it's going to be a catch-all kind of going forward.
Okay, and that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Well, let's spend a minute and go into some nuances a little bit. We talk about virtual reality. We've used the word spatial.
Mm,
Apple and others, and we see those as really different things because VR has been this all-encompassing drop some into an environment, take them somewhere else. Where a lot of times spatial is uh, like this is a good example. I could potentially see my home office here around us,
yeah.
bringing us together. How, if you were going to describe kind of the difference between spatial and VR and even augmented reality, how would you differ those?
I mean, to be honest with you, I fall into the camp of just calling everything VR. And I think and I think like part of that is there's a lot of tribalism around the delineations. So there's some people that are like, no, MR is better, like no, VR is better, and like no, actually both of this is crap, right? We need AR, and I'm like, it's really just spectrums of the same thing at the end of the day. So it's just communicating the idea of like what is that spectrum is really what matters, right? And particularly to like the outsiders, right? Because I think like us as industry nerds, right, we can sit there and get very specific about, well, the difference between let's say like MR quote unquote and VR quote unquote is the kind of like fully immersive versus the half immersive, or however you want to put it, right? Um, Normies don't understand that, right? And I think a lot of this is also about like communicating outwards, like what are we talking about here?
Right.
And I
It's
think,
one of the things I personally love about the Vision Pro itself is
yeah,
that whether it's the augmented reality, virtual reality, or spatial computing of bring my Windows in, bring my Big Mac in, those types of things, just
yeah.
it covers enough of that spectrum to be interesting as opposed to some of the new glasses, for example, that are out there. They are really cool, but limited.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think the Vision Pro is, I wish I would use it more, and I had more things to do on it, to be honest. But I think I mean, it's really a phenomenal device, and it's like I don't think anybody that uses it can't go like anything but wow the first time, right?
So, looking at really the history of VR, there's
Mm,
been some really interesting things from an entertainment, a scientific, or other exploratory perspective. Our focus is specifically really in the business and the enterprise world. Have you
yeah.
seen any uses of VR where it actually paid off on a business value? I know
Oh,
that's an
I
area
mean,
people are
yeah.
constantly struggling with is what's the business value of doing this?
Right. Well, I can actually tell you. So one of the things that we publicly talk about VR a lot, right, is there's very big indexing on consumer
Hmm.
VR, right, as in terms of measurement of how well this medium is doing, right? We talk about how many units is Meta selling, right? Like what apps are making money. Like people talk about Gorilla Tag and whatever IP they're trying to port to the Quest, etc. And like that's fine, and I think there are definitely a lot of success stories to point out there, probably more than the public perceives. But the one thing that I'm almost 99.9% certain of is that there's more aggregate value or economic value currently on the enterprise side, and that actually really ballooned last year. I mean, really, like
Hmm.
anybody I talk to that's doing something that's remotely horizontal across enterprise, so be provisioning headsets or whatever, right, where they're working with enterprises, they were over the moon last year in 2024 right, with the amount of business that they've had. And so, but the thing that I've seen is that okay, consumer has again take like another axiom on the consumer side, right? Very big, economic success. They made a ton of money. What's true, I think, on the enterprise side is that there's more aggregate value, but it's extremely fragmented. So there are a lot of businesses that are, like again, like I get decks all the time where it's some random companies sitting in a random part of the country that I've never heard of, right? I've never heard of these people at all. But hey, they built like a VR business that makes like $5 million a year, and like so most of these things that you tend to find, it's almost exclusively, I would say, very training and education focused, right? So there are
A heavy use case, yeah.
And so there are all these studios, companies, like, they're like 12, 15 people, they're small companies. Again, they're making $5 million a year where they ship some solution for some like really nichey, random enterprise training thing, and they make $5 million. And again, there are just a ton of these, right? So what I think is actually the more interesting part is, yeah, you can add all of that up and say, hey, you can make a nice little business here, right? Because clearly there's a lot of appetite to buy headsets and to do all this enterprise training. But what I think is actually more interesting is, like, who's going to come and defragment some of these things, because again, there is so much aggregate value there.
And how do we
It
take some of those, and whether it's starting with the training and then moving farther into a more
right,
integrated vertical set of solutions? And
yeah,
the words we use for something like that are, okay, how are we giving people superpowers? So
yeah,
the upfront learning, absolutely. The continuous
right,
ongoing reinforcement, great. How's it helping me do my job on a day-to-day basis?
right.
And that most folks aren't there yet.
Yeah, but I think that's where the opportunity is, because again, the thing I would just take a lot of heart in on the VR side is that clearly there's a lot of willingness
Hmm.
from enterprises to try this at the very least, right? And it seems to be working successfully, because again, I think there was a bit of a, I say this in like in kind of quotations, boom, right? Like 2021, kind of when everything kind of went into to hyperdrive, that
Hmm.
then nosedived, and now it's kind of like bouncing back, right? And so, which leads me to think, like, again, there's like there are a lot of apps that are being built that are like genuinely useful for a lot of companies, and the fact that that's being invested in, I think I would take a lot of optimism, and more so than anything that's happening to the consumer, you read in the news, right? Because let's face it, like,
Hmm.
ton of small little businesses making money, right? It's not going to make news headlines, right? Meta doing something with some whatever, right? Like that's going to make the news. And so I think that's
Yeah.
the difference. So I think part of this I would take from it is, don't believe the headlines, because a lot of the interesting things that's happening very in the ground floor of all of this is just not stuff that makes a good Wall Street Journal headline, right? Like, in the end of the day, that's why they're not writing it, right?
Yep. It's about the headlines. I
Yeah,
totally get
yeah,
that.
yeah,
Um, well, let's talk a little bit more about I'll say the today and the near term.
yeah,
One of the things that I have as a core belief is that technology is supposed to help people connect, and I
yep,
think this is a beautiful example of that. Um,
absolutely.
are you seeing examples or ways that whether it's the spatial computing, the VR, is helping to connect people, especially at work?
I mean, I think at work, to be honest, it's something I'm thinking about more. So we actually recently invested in a company that's kind of doing this. I would say it's not really like their core product right now, but it's like one of the underlying themes of this, kind of remote collaboration concept.
Hmm.
I don't think, to be honest with you, I've seen a lot yet that's really stuck. And I think, kind of back to my previous point, I think that there is a big opportunity around that, though, because
Yeah.
there again, there are so many enterprises investing in this that are using it, right? That there is some sort of maybe more horizontal co-working kind of solution. I've seen more and more companies actually dabble in that space, right?
Oh
About
yeah. Well, in the
about
business, go ahead. Sorry.
right, but basically this idea, like, to make it reporting very layman's terms, is like the what does the zoom of 3D look like, right? Because it's not
Hmm.
necessarily a straight copy, right? There are changes in modalities, so subsequently the product kind of changes, and so
Yep.
I have seen some signs that there's some founders beginning to figure out, like, no, no, these are actually the ways we need to adapt this to make it very sticky, and where
Hmm.
the enterprises really feel the benefit of this. The tangential kind of longer term point, though, I would make is that I wouldn't really poo-poo, let's say, necessarily like the whole gorilla tag phenomenon, right? Like, in a lot of these things that are going on with like the Gen Alphas of the world, right? Because these are generations that, okay, they're 8, 9, 10 years old today, but they're going to be employees in 10, 15 years, right? And these are people that are
Hmm.
growing up with, my main modality almost of using a computer is to go into some 3D space and interact with
Yep.
somebody digitally. And so I think there's definitely, like, I think for our generations, for all intents and purposes, this might still be more difficult to wrap your head around, right? This kind of like displacement into with a headset into a different virtual environment.
As opposed to those that are
Right.
living it from the get-go. Yeah.
Right. And so
Yeah.
you have a younger generation now that's actually completely growing up natively with that idea of this modality of communication with somebody else, right? And so, like, I think once more and more of that generation starts to, tip over into the workforce at some point, I think that's
Hmm.
when you're going to really see the hockey stick on this, because again, you're getting to a generation where this is just normal, right? This isn't an adjustment. That's just what they're used to. And so I think that's really like something to look forward to as well, right? That, like, kids love this. And because kids love it, kids become adults at some point. So guess what, right?
It's the solutions they're going to be demanding.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
exactly. Yeah,
hmm Well, so fast forward a little bit more to when they're getting ready to that or soon.
yeah,
So we're talking a lot on VR and spatial.
yeah.
What's the impact of AI here? What happens in these environments when we can bring AI brain power to it?
Well, I mean, to be fair, like, I get asked this question a lot. I think when I first started pitching the fund, right, I was like, well, like VR and AI are very like the way it pitched at the beginning was they're symbiotic technologies, right? And so some people asked me to explain that, and I said, well, I mean, listen, I mean, literally, this whole thing is just already work of AI, like all of it, right? Like the hand tracking, the spatial, like you name it, right? Like the anchors, everything that you have is like completely AI driven
So AI is
already.
baked into everything
Right.
we're currently experiencing. Yes.
Yeah, without like advanced CV and all this stuff, like we wouldn't have this, right? And so
hmm
so it already starts there, and you're kind of just you're just hacking on it, right? Like that's really what you're doing. Like I mentioned before, like even take your Chat GPT, it gives you insights, particularly now, right? One of the things that I think is really notable that you started to see since the end of last year with this whole total push to multimodality, right? It used to just
Yeah.
be text input, text based, text output, right? And it's slowly gone to give me pictures, give me video, right? Like basically, so things that we see, things that we perceive. And guess what? Like there's no better computer in the world right now to perceive human behavior or to sort of censor human behavior than a VR headset, right? Like a VR system. Um,
hmm
so inherently, it's just a much more natural interface. So again, all of these things that they're really trying to do, right, with multimodality and all of that. And so it's just
So given
better way.
that, how
Yeah.
long until there's a third virtual person sitting next to us here that
I mean,
is AI powered? What do you think?
if in a technical or in a product sense, right? Because I think those are those of course the two questions.
Yes.
Because I think in terms of technical feasibility, to some extent, you could probably already do this now, right? Now, I would still argue though that I'm putting my AI engineer hat back on now, but that a lot of these LLMs in many ways are probably less intelligent than they're thought to be. Just I'll give you
How so? How
I'll,
so?
I'll give you a simple example, right? Because they always talk about like one of the buzzwords you're seeing a lot now is like PhD level knowledge, right? Or PhD level
hmm
whatever, right? Like these things are going to be as good as PhDs. I'm like, well, a PhD can tell me what their right hand is and like what they're feeling in it. Like an LLM can't do that, right?
Right. No
Um,
physical nature at all. Yeah.
Right, and so they have absolutely no sense of like spatial embodiment and stuff like which is as humans we do, right? And
hmm
so like those sorts of are like the issues, right? I could tell a 5-year old, don't put your right hand on the stovetop because it's hot, right? You could say that to an LLM, but it doesn't actually genuinely know what it means, right? Like it doesn't know what its right hand
hmm
is. It doesn't know what really hot is, right? In a perception because it just doesn't again it doesn't have the ability to actually sense that, right? So there's still a lot of issues, like particularly I think if you want to just embody these things into 3D beings, be it digital or
hmm
real, right? So because you could easily apply this to robotics as well, which is why I always kind of make the argument that like robotics and VR are actually the opposite ends of the same spectrum. Um, where that's the delta right now, right? So sure, you can get it to like spew whatever kind of like academic stuff you want. Granted, some of that stuff is still flawed, but very kind of basic human behavior, right? These things don't know out of the box how to emulate because again, they're just not in that form factor. So I think there's still some gap there, and again, I think they'll get figured out. But I would say like high quality, give it maybe I would say maybe 5 years. I think like if I'm trying to be intellectually honest here, I give it three
hmm
to 5 years
Okay.
until you
Okay.
get like a nice properly functioning virtual being, right, that can kind of behave and act like we do, right?
Nice. Nice. Thank you for the forecasting
Yeah,
there.
yeah. Like, well, let's see. I'll probably be wrong, and in 5 years, we're going to be no further than we are today. Oops, I knocked the glass over.
Oh.
Um, but yeah, I mean, it's on its way. But I think the core point is that like we should contextualize what we see with like the chat GPTs of the world for what they are, right? And which is they can regurgitate a lot of good academic stuff and synthesize a lot of data that you give it, right? But it lacks complete spatial, like it has no spatial awareness whatsoever, right?
Right. And that's so
Yeah,
critical is really
yeah,
understand where are the gaps.
yeah,
What's it
yeah.
great at? What is it not? And that.
Right.
So speaking of which, let's actually talk since you've had a chance to go both hands-on behind the scenes at Meta, and obviously
hmm
you're using the Apple product right now on the Vision Pro side of things.
Yeah.
Um, Not about a religious debate, but if you just look at the two companies, what what jumps out at you is kind of just, I guess, general, whether it's go-to-market or technology beliefs or just anything you could share
Yeah.
publicly, but between differences between the two.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big difference is just like you have to look at the DNAs of the companies, right? And I think that you start to make sense of a lot of what their strategies are. So this might be a little bit spicy, particularly on the meta side. So maybe this is a good thing to clip. But um, I mean, Meta historically, let's just quickly look at like why did they decide to do this whole VR stuff anyway, right? Why did they embark down this? And so the origin of it is, keep in mind, Meta, most of its money comes from ad revenue that they generate in social media, right? So first and
Right.
foremost, it's a social media company. So Meta decided to embark on this whole journey of AR VR because their perception, which I agree with, is that this is the next medium, right? Like, you had
Right.
PC,
This
you
is
had
where we're headed.
mobile.
Right.
The idea of computing spatially is the next frontier. And guess what? We're getting really annoyed with how on mobile, which is the kind of new current paradigm that obviously Facebook lived, right? Because they started as a fully PC based, right? Because it was still a PC world. Mobile came, they didn't do anything, and they're obviously pissed off that Apple and Google and whatever their big tech rivals are kind of like shafting them with the mobile ecosystem, right? They have to pay them 30%. They can impose draconian rule on them, whatever. They don't like this, right? So their philosophy from the beginning was, let's own the next thing so we don't have to deal with this.
Mm.
Is largely what their motivation was. So again, it really still comes to the end of them distributing their social media. And so I think part of the philosophical difference, whereas Apple, to kind of make it quick, I wasn't there, but I mean, you can just see on the outside, it's effectively a hardware company. It's a computing platform company. That's what they do. They build platforms, right? They're not so much, in apps and social media and this kind of stuff. They just want to build computer ecosystems that, are top of line, basically. And so I mean, that's I think really fundamentally where you see the difference, right? Like, you use the Vision Pro, you just see it. It's beautiful to use, right? You can definitely see where this is going. Like, everything is higher quality. The build quality of the product is better, etc. And it's a very good ambassador for like what this medium is going to be. Where you can tell they're playing the long game with this thing. It's probably too
It's a good way to
sophisticated.
put it.
It's too sophisticated for the average consumer at this point. It's too expensive, and I think that's largely what it was designed for, right? So like I think it's
Yeah.
for people like you and I to buy it. It's not for an average Joe to buy it yet, right? And so they're playing the long game with this. Meta is extremely indexed on this idea, in my opinion, of owning the future of social media in a different medium. And so
Mm.
everything that they're doing is actually ends to that, which is, for example, why I think you see this very, very big push now, particularly over, say, over, it's always kind of been there, but I feel like it's gotten more intense over the last year to push Horizon Worlds, like they're kind of
Okay.
their quote unquote metaverse. Despite that, being I think very at a conflict of interest with the third party developer ecosystem, which I think has been a disaster. Because they're just really indexed. Like, they don't really care about the third party devs, right? They just want Horizon Worlds to
It's
work
about the
because
world. Okay.
if they don't own the social media on it, right? If they're not the kings of the social media and that medium as well, who cares? Basically, like, this is not really this is kind
And
of tangential to our core
so
business.
if I can, it almost comes back to, so we talk about Apple as the hardware, the platform. It gives me something to do and experience this environment.
Yeah,
Whereas what you were just describing for Meta is, what I'm actually hearing is it's actually a data play.
yeah.
It's about
That's
the
what.
social media. It's about the data. It's
Sure.
about the integrate. It's the
Yeah.
link to the people in that way. Does that feel right?
Yeah, I think that's definitely one way you could deduce it. And, it's really just comes down to, again, like, what is Meta? Meta is a social media company. That's what they know how to do. And so if they're going to, what I think is just really rearing its head now. I think for a long time you could have made the argument that, okay, they really are trying to build, develop ecosystem and all of that. I
Mm.
think over the last year in particular, I've grown a lot more cynical on that. And again, this is also coming from my standpoint of, I've invested in a lot of VR studios and third-party devs and all of that. And you're kind of, you're seeing both kind of three sides of the table, right? And I just really cannot come to any other conclusion than Meta is just interested in their first party social media that they're trying to push on this device, and everything else is a means to funnel people into that. And so the ends for them is Horizon Worlds. The ends for them is not necessarily the quest itself being a very big um, the Quest itself being a very big headset in the long run, right? It's Horizon OS, their operating system, yes, right? Why? Because
Right.
it goes back to the same thing, right? Like, they're not paying anybody if somebody's accessing Horizon Worlds through Horizon OS
So
headset,
they've got
right?
control. They've got the
Right.
data, and some limits around what third parties are able to leverage.
100%. I think that, and in my opinion, that's really the nuts and bolts of what it's all about with Meta. Whereas Apple, of course,
Interesting.
again has a very different kind of philosophy, of course, as they always have, right? They've built hardware ecosystems. They know how to do this. This is just kind of the next rendition, right? Not the case for Meta. And I think again, that's just what you're seeing in product execution is that's just very clear.
Oh, I love it. Well, thank
Yeah,
you for going deep into that. I
yeah,
think that's, especially when we start talking business and enterprise, that's something everybody has to really chew on. So that was
yeah.
awesome to dig into.
One thing I'll just add to the particular on the enterprise point. So there's definitely, I can't say too much about this at this point, but sort of at the time of this recording, I do think even on the enterprise side, there's definitely a lot of things Meta is trying to do to lock enterprises into their operating system, and that I think will only continue to come. And I think, particularly with incoming competition, obviously not just from Apple, right, kind of at the high end, but particularly like Android XR, which is obviously rumored to come out later this year. We'll see when it actually
Mhm.
comes, but we know it's coming. I think that's what Meta is actually worried about because that's kind of like the real competition because Apple's going to always plays its own game, right, kind of at the top of the
Right.
market,
But
but
that becomes the alternative of
right.
the alternative platforms.
Correct, right? And
Hmm.
and 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 so I think Meta's really worried about Android XR, and so I think what they're really trying to do now is their philosophy, in my opinion, to saying how do we get people to stay in our ecosystem, for example, not go to Android at some point, is to just lock it down further, right? To make the cost of switching impossible, right? Like and actually tighten the screws rather than loosen them.
Mm.
I don't think that will work personally. But that's again what it's all about, right? Like they just don't want to get screwed for their first party content. They don't want to get screwed by some other big tech company, right? I think that's really what it comes down to.
Got it. Well, that again, appreciate the deep dive into
Yeah.
that, and I hope you're wrong, but I appreciate your deep dive into
Oh,
that.
believe me too. I don't say this happily. Don't get me wrong, but it's like I've always tried to be like a half, like glass half full kind of guy looking at this. But I've almost kind of resigned myself into be a little bit more like glass half empty in terms of like what Meta's intentions are with all of this and the motivations are behind this. I think actually, if you want to see this illustrated, Boz, so their CTO, he'd recently put out there's this leaked memo of his recently that he shared
Mm.
with Meta. I think this is like 2, 3 days ago, where it's basically like 2025 is like the year we have to prove that this is a thing, right? Like that this is a thing. And so if you go into how he defines success for Meta in this whole foray into AR VR, I think it's difficult to come away with a different conclusion than the one I just gave you. It's like he almost spells it out for you that's kind of what their measurement is. And again, I don't think that's a good thing at all. I think it's a big mistake, and I'm kind of getting to a point where I am ready for a new leader. I think Meta did a great job in paving the road for a lot of this, but to me, they just clearly don't seem fit or well aligned to kind of take it from, they maybe did the 0 to 1, but really more the 1 to N
Right.
growth of the industry. And so I'm kind of very ready for, be it Google or be it Apple or whoever, right, that kind of spearheads this kind of next wave of adoption, if you want to call it that. 'Cause I think Meta is just, again, like what they're trying to do is just, it's not an interest of the actual growth of the medium. It's in the interest of the growth of Meta.
Yes. A
Um,
little self-serving.
yeah, exactly, and
I'm
not
hearing
not
that
in a
loud
good
and
way,
clear.
right? And not
Right.
and
Right.
not in a good way, right? Like you can make an argument that like them being self-serving is
Well, it's hurting the ecosystem and
right,
environment around them,
correct, right?
and
You could
the
say
level of
exactly
innovation that can come to that.
100%, right? And I think that's they could do it in a self-serving way, right? Because let's say their alignment was with third-party devs, right? If
Hmm.
they said, "Hey, our success is also basically measured by like how many really high usage apps we have," right? And so that means like, "Hey, we're going to do everything to make our developers figure out a way to be successful in this medium." Whereas I think the reality, for example, on the ground, again, because they're so driven on Horizon Worlds, is um, we're going to be the referee and the player on the field at the same time. And
I think that's called cheating.
yeah, no, exactly right. And I mean, so you talk to devs, they complain about it all the time, right? They go on these things about like, well, I was building a game, and then they just Meta decided to copy it and basically build a version of it to Horizon Worlds, and they distribute that, right? They just
Hmm.
pulled the rug
Hmm.
from under me, basically. Like we don't get distribution anymore or anything because we're technically competing with them now, right? And like, like that's not an environment, right? We have kind of these constant landmines where like third-party devs are going to be like particularly enthusiastic, right, about
Yeah.
building for it because it's never like, oh, Meta's trying to help us, right? And their interests are aligned with our interests, but it's No, it could be that maybe today they're aligned, but not tomorrow they're not, right? Because they decide that this is a great idea and they need to actually own it first party.
So I
Uh,
think you're kicking up some topics for our future conversation. We'll
yes.
go back into developer
Yeah.
ecosystems and things like
Yeah.
that. So that
Yeah.
thank you. That was awesome to dig into. And
Yeah.
again, thanks for joining us for another spatial conversation today, Arian.
Thank you.
Definitely appreciate it. Got to get that
All
fist
right.
bump in there. I love that interaction.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, that is
That's
awesome.
great. Yeah. Awesome.
Thank you again for jumping in, and
Of course.
thanks for
Thanks for having me.
joining us.